Welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, where stories about the power of focus and resilience are revealed by the people who live those stories. And now, the host of the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, Jack Hopkins.
Hello and welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast. I'm your host, Jack Hopkins. Today's guest is Noel Casler, and he's best known for his outspoken commentary on Twitter and unveiling truths in his weekly car rants about his 25 years of experience behind the scenes in live television and the music industry. Noel spent 6 seasons working directly with the Trump family on Celebrity Apprentice and toured with many musicians such as Bruce Springsteen, the Rolling Stones, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and many others. These experiences inform and guide his work as a stand-up comedian, giving him a unique perspective and many first-hand stories to draw upon, making his humor both captivating and hilarious. Noel's tweets and car rants are often cited on MSNBC and various other news programs. Videos of his stand-up routines have reached millions, especially his revelations about working with the Trump family. Noel is a frequent guest on various SiriusXM and iHeartRadio podcasts. In 2021, he decided to officially launch his own aptly named podcast, the Noel Casler podcast. Noel excels at breaking down complex socio-political subjects into funny and entertaining vignettes that often go viral. Utilizing his large and loyal online following, the Noel Casler podcast is a mainstay of the Apple Podcast charts under comedic interviews, or comedy interviews, I should say. Since its debut, there have been hundreds of thousands of downloads and continuing growth in streams each week. His live show, The Unverified Tour, features his comedic takes, insights, and heartfelt observations that his fans have grown to love. Listen, I'm going to tell you, if you've got something going on this week that you can put off for about an hour and 23 minutes, go ahead and put it off now and use that time to watch or listen, or both, to this episode with Noel Casler. If you want the straight scoop, I mean the straight scoop and the blunt scoop, on Donald Trump and Donald Trump's sphere around him and the people in it, this is the episode that you want to watch or listen to. There are a couple of things on here that he told me it's the first time he's ever shared in a podcast, in any podcast, his own or any of the others where he's been a guest on a podcast. I can tell you this. You are in for a treat. So, let's get right into this episode with Noel Casler. All right, so I think you know how excited I've been about having you on the show. First of all, congratulations on, I know it's not brand new, but it's really your Noel's Notes on Substack is really exploding. And that's something that a lot of people are talking about. So let's kind of kick it off just by talking about that newsletter and what you do on there.
Thank you, Jack. I mean, I really appreciate it. And in many ways, it's the culmination of everything I've done since Trump ran for office in 2015. You know, I've spoken out in various ways as a comic. On the stand-up stage is where it began. And then, you know, on Twitter and in podcasts and in the car rants, I was an early guy in those car rants and they were going viral. But, you know, we get older, right? And the world gets very complex. And I like the written word because you can really take your time and make the emotional points and the intellectual sort of points that I want to make. And, you know, it's not, most of what I do, as you know, is off the cuff. You know, connect with your truth and speak it, brother. That's what I see you doing, and that's why you're resonating with people. You know, and I got a big mouth, but so sometimes it helps for me to write something out longhand and then type it up and say, all right, I can leave this part out. You know, I don't need to hit him over the head with that and really, you know, stretch out a little bit. And I'm not a kid who did homework. You know, I'm a kid who was like, I was the bad class clown. So it's ironic that at this point in my life, I'm writing so much and I'm getting a lot out of it. So I appreciate the kind words.
Well, on that note, I always wanted to be the kid who was the class clown, but I just wasn't funny. So I just stirred trouble elsewhere.
Right on, brother.
Let's talk about what you're doing now. I know you were in Miami recently. Was that pleasure? Was that work?
It was actually part of work. It was part of the Substacks thing. I started going down there 2 years ago ahead of the midterms. I got invited to the White House ahead of the midterms. They invited me once. They haven't asked me back, but they let me in once. I'd been there in a previous career. I was behind the scenes. I did all kinds of stuff down there. But so I went down there and they were sort of trying to reach out to influencers in terms of messaging ahead of the midterms, because Biden's stuff was making a big difference, right? The Infrastructure Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Bill, rather, the Inflation Reduction Act. These things had real world positive consequences that, of course, President Harris will carry on. And I wanted to kind of get out into the swing states and the heartland and see how it was working. So I went to Pennsylvania. And then I went to Florida, and I'd see these job sites, right? Business is booming for contractors, and I'd see these brand new Ford F-150s. Everybody's got a new pickup. They got a job. They got a nice, Yeti cooler. Things are good, right?
Right.
But they got a bumper sticker that says, let's go Brandon or something, or a second A kind of thing. And I wanted to address the cultural thing that was still keeping these guys feeling conservative, where a Republican, while they were not realizing who was actually working on their behalf, which was President Biden and the Democratic Party, as it's always been, for the most part, right?
Sure.
Since the World War and the GI Bill. And, I come from an Irish Catholic, working class family that bootstrapped up a little bit and went into the government and stuff. But, that in many ways, I feel like we're all one people. Right. And a lot of people that have fallen under the sway of Trumpism, I consider my people, even though I'm a liberal city guy. I grew up in upstate New York and Maryland and places where look, man, you're getting conned. So a long answer to your question, I wanted to dive into that. And the best way to do that for me is in person, to see what's going on, boots on the ground, because in many ways, Florida, I'm right outside of Palm Beach when I go down there. It's ground zero for this stuff, as you know.
Right. I understand, I think, what you mean when you say they're my people. I grew up in a town, and in fact, that's where I'm recording from right now, in a county where in 2020, 8 out of 10 people who voted for Donald Trump. In my non-professional life and before my professional life, I was put the hat on backward. That's kind of where I came from, right? And so I understand these people on the foundational level because I'm one of them. I used to be a Republican. What I don't understand is how they have gone so far beyond that threshold, right? And that's coming from somebody who was on the other side of it or with them for a little while until a certain point, and I said, my God, what's happening here? This is insane. And I pulled the plug, and the rest is history. It didn't come without consequences, I will tell you that. And I think that's why so many people who would love to, perhaps, don't. Just because they'll kind of keep that growing angst for Donald Trump wrapped up inside because of the people they go to church with and things of that nature. So tell me about how comedy serves as a good vehicle for addressing some of these issues.
That's an insightful question, and I respect where you're coming from, Jack. And you're my kind of people. I get it. That's what I'm talking about. And that's why I went into comedy, because I was like, the guys that were falling under the sway of Trump were guys I went to high school with. They were guys that I worked alongside with in TV. I worked in talent logistics, and I was a road manager for rock bands. So I worked with law enforcement. I did security.
Right.
Like, I'm not the security guard, obviously. I'm the little guy, like, controlling it. But I did, the tree lighting at Rockefeller Center, the ball drop at Times Square. I worked on presidential inaugurations. So, I'm worked with Secret Service and law enforcement. I got a lot of friends on the job, in New York. I grew up with kids that were sons of cops and contractors and, hardworking, good Americans. And it's what you just said. They don't turn, because I've had them tell me privately, like, hey, my wife loves this guy, but I can tell he's a con man. And I've known you for 30 years and you know him better than I do. But culturally, they're in the middle of it, right? They're in the town that has all the flags up and it's a good thing, but the veterans that served on the flagpoles, and they go to the kids' sports game and everybody's got the little bit of the Trump stuff on or the American flag. And you don't want to be labeled as somebody who's going against the grain. So it really is a cultural issue, right?
Yes.
And I figured comedy was a great way to poke through that. And my thesis statement as a comedian was basically like, look, I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. I got family that's Republican. I got a lot of friends Republican. I respect that. As a matter of fact, I think we need balance in our government. We need both sides, because I'm a hippie. I'll give everything away. You know what I mean? You need somebody. Right? You need somebody to be like, hey, let's rein it in a little bit. Let's get a little conservative with the money. That's how it works positively. That's what you want. You know what I mean? No problem with that. And I worked on Capitol Hill as a young man when things used to work correctly in the late 80s. I was a messenger for the Congressional Budget Office, but that was an era of tightening belts after the Reagan sort of deregulation, overspending that got out of control by the late 80s, right? So, the bipartisan thing is the way to go. So I figured as a comedian, let me talk to guys like, look, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I know this man. He's a con man. Okay. He's telling you he's on your side, but he's not. He's on the side of billionaires and crooked Russians and all these other freaks that I would see backstage on his shows at the after parties. And as a matter of fact, when I started working for him, he was a Democrat. He had Bill and Hillary at his wedding to Melania. He's an opportunist. If he had been embraced by the left, he'd love it. He'd love to be at the Emmys last night. That's his fucking dream. Sorry to curse. You know what I mean?
No, let it rip.
Right, but that's who he is. So he's bullshitting you. But you can't come at people aggressively with that stuff, especially now, how polarized we are. So comedy is kind of a way to tell the truth about somebody and make everybody feel welcome. Like, here, we're all having a laugh here. I'm not attacking you. Sometimes Republicans will be the butt of my jokes, but so will the best comedians are very self-effacing, and that's how I am. Like I just said to you, I get it. I had a guy over here fixing the roof the other day, coming to do an estimate on the roof. He's got all the tats. He's obviously a Republican, but I'm probably into the Trump stuff, but I was able to communicate with him. We talked about bands. We talked about where we grew up. We talked about food, which is always a common thing. And, I don't want a vegan roofer. You know what I mean?
Right.
I want a guy who's from that world a little bit, because that's the hard working culture, right? I don't want a guy who doesn't have any background in that hard work, because there's some that work ethic. And I think the only way we truly recover from this as a country is if we pull everybody in, because we're all in the same boat, right? We're only winning this thing when we all come back together. You're not going to be able to push those people away forever, and you shouldn't want to. Just like they shouldn't want to push away migrants, who, as you and I both know, are some of the hardest working people and most skilled
Absolutely.
I've ever seen, right? And we're all migrants. We all came from that,
I spent a summer, one of the hottest summers on record, I think. This was probably 1989, 1990, in Phoenix, Arizona, working outside like 12, 14 hours a day, right? And at the end of the day, brother, I was fucking ragged.
Right.
I was shot. And I would watch these Hispanic crews working nearby. I mean, at the end of the day, they could still go out and party, right? They were just rolling with it. Here in the Midwest, where the humidity is terrible, Phoenix, at least the humidity is fairly low. One year, a couple of years back, there was it was probably 80% humidity, right? 100 plus degrees. And all of the white roofing crews had ceased work for the week, right? These Hispanic roofing crews didn't miss a beat. Now, I know there were a lot of pissed off people in this town that the other roofing crews took the week off, right? Because they're getting behind and they're wanting to get their house roofed. Some of the same people, and I know this for a fact, some of the same people who were so friggin' thankful for those Hispanic crews that were up there busting ass are some of the same people who are now driving around with the, go Brandon, or let's go Brandon, and the Trump flags. And again, it's that culture thing. When it applies to them in the immediate moment, they're flexible, right? Sure, I'll let a Hispanic crew that may or may not all be legal immigrants roof my house because I need something. Right. But once their immediate needs are taken care of, right, it's right back on the Trump train, which is it. But it's human behavior 101. And I think that's what's so frustrating is because as soon as we get wrapped in the idea of how in the hell is this happening, having a psychology background, I know how it's happening. It's human behavior, sadly, and that it is what it is. So let's go to, let's talk about your days with Trump, right? Now, I've posted this before, and recently, before Elon really started putting the hammer on me, it was one of my viral tweets. I don't know, it's probably been in the last month and a half. And it was a tweet about you and the things that you say, never getting pushback from Donald Trump. Donald Trump never threatening you with a lawsuit. Donald Trump never suing you. And you keep dumping these truths out and nothing happens. And the point that I made in that tweet was that you've got the receipts, and he knows that. Yeah. That's why he doesn't, file a lawsuit against you. I'm assuming. Am I right?
Yeah, correct. Well, he's a coward, first of all. Everybody thinks he's super litigious, and he was involved in 4,000 lawsuits before he became president, which should have been all anybody needed to know about the man. Both a plaintiff and a defendant, because he skips out on contractors like you were just saying. I mean, he's ruined lives all over the East Coast. Dudes put in carpet in Taj Mahal, don't get paid, can't pay their subcontractors, can't pay their mortgage, ruined lives, and did it for decades. He's a coward. He'd rather pay pennies on a dollar and tie you up in court than pay his bills, which, we don't have to go into how despicable that is, So, and I love what you just said about workers, not to, backtrack, but the crews are incredible. And I want to take these guys aside who run the contracting companies and be like, you're showing up, you're giving me an estimate, you got a brand new pickup truck, and I'm going to say yes to the gig. And 3 days from now, a bunch of, immigrants are going to come here and work their asses off for the next week. And you're going to get a fatter check than they are. Don't sit home and watch Fox News at night and demonize these people because they're putting food on your family's table, brother. Welcome them in and help them move up because they got kids who don't want to mow the lawn. They got kids who want to go to college and become writers and doctors and lawyers, and we should all want that. That's what we are, and that's how you're strongest. So I just another tangent. The Trump stuff, he's a coward. And that's why he has big tech on his side. Somebody like Elon. I've seen that he's throttled your tweets. He did that to me when he took over the thing. 2 years ago when he bought Twitter, my account grew by 100,000 followers a year for 4 years. And I have less followers now than the day he took over. People stopped seeing my tweets. It stopped growing. He did that to the left because anybody who went viral and attacked Trump, he wants out of there. Now, the reason I spoke out about Trump, it wasn't that I was sure he wouldn't sue because I broke an NDA. I had an NDA with Mark Burnett, not with Trump, but with the production that I worked on, which is The Apprentice, And in 2015, when he was running, I talked to my coworkers and I said, this guy's a maniac. We got to start saying what we saw behind the scenes, And a lot of my colleagues in live TV were like, look, dude, he's not going to win. And if I start spilling the beans, we got contracts, we're in the DGA, we're in unions, we'll never work again. Because I worked in a very sensitive side of television, which is the talent departments, right? So you don't see what you saw. Not that everything was crazy. It's just, it's rule number one. I worked with Madonna, Michael Jackson, like you name it. When you work behind the scenes, you can't be talking about what goes on because it's looked at on the producers and nobody's going to trust you. It's just rule number one. So my colleagues, not that they were cowards, but they're like, look, I got kids in college. You know, I'm the, you know, I know guys that directed shows that he was on that were like, look, I saw everything you saw, but I got the same, NDA. I'm not going to throw my career away for this moron. And nobody thought he was going to win. Anyway, back in 2015, 16, right? And I was kind of like, well, if he does win, there's nothing on the other side of this because he's such a maniac, he'll shut down the world. And that's what happened, right? He bumbled the pandemic. Right. There was no TV production for a year. There was nothing for a year, right? We're all locked in our houses for most of the year. And he was out golfing, right? But so I said, I'm going to speak out. So I had to walk away from that career. And I'd been doing it since 1993, almost 25 years. I had a cushy career. I toured with bands, but the main stuff was, the Tony Awards and the Super Bowl halftime show and all this stuff I did, which was fun. But, I was in a position I could walk away. I don't have any kids. I was like, you know what? Sure. To me, it's more important to speak out. So let me go at him. Let me just tell him all the stuff. He does wear Depends. Okay. He's incontinent because he's a drug addict, because he snorts Adderall, because he can't read. He'd get really nervous about seeing a 3-syllable word on a cue card. He'd freak out. He'd storm off set. He'd snort crushed up Adderall because it makes his brain feel in control. And then he'd get in a rage and he'd defecate because you lose control of your bowels and stuff. This is all true. I don't care if people believe me or not. That's not for me. Use your own judgment. Right. Piece it together. I'm telling you what I saw. I don't need to prove it, and you can't prove it. It's my word against whoever, right? Because most people, are, as I just explained, weren't going to put their necks out there, Right. And the point was, it didn't really matter. Like, I didn't care that he was abusing drugs. I was the road manager for, like, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, dude. You know what I mean? Like, I toured with 70-year-olds. If you can do drugs and do the gig, more power to you, It's like, that's my business. What I was explaining to people is that he was in active addiction. And if you understand the psychological components of that, it's the last guy you want in a position of power because he's only thinking about himself. So I'm not denigrating addiction. I'm in recovery myself. I got in the recovery movement 19 years ago. You know what I mean? I'm a daily person who's involved in my own recovery. Not, I think sometimes people might think when I call him a drug addict, I'm denigrating people. I'm not. I'm a child of an alcoholic. Like, that runs deep in my family, and I take it seriously, and I do the work to not, fall back into that. But my point is, if you're living in active addiction, you're full of resentment. You're full of self-centered fear and lashing out. And if you look at him, that's who he is. That's what he constantly is. He hates Taylor Swift. He hates Nancy Pelosi. It's me, me, me. And that is the last thing you want in a leader. And this is what I explain to people, because I said, when something bad happens, he's only going to think about himself. And that's precisely what happened with the pandemic, right? He knew about it in January, as we know from the Bob Woodward tapes, right? Yes. He goes, oh, Bob, this thing's terrible. Like, it fucking melts your eyes. You know what I mean? But in public, he was like, hey, it's no big deal. There's 50 people on a cruise ship. I'll just leave them out to sea. Everything's fine. And that was an addict because he was thinking about his reelection and how it would hurt his campaign and how it would hurt the stock market. He wasn't thinking about caring for the people, that he was in charge of leading.
With that, I asked this question because I've posted this before, and I usually post it in terms of I can't imagine that he, or I suspect very strongly that the guy's not capable of loving another human being, at least in the way that most of us understand to love another human being. That if he in any way would start to feel vulnerable, which is really what loving somebody fully is about, that he's out. Am I close on that?
You're an extremely intelligent person, Jack, and I appreciate it. Your question's completely insightful, right? And I almost oversimplify it talking about the addiction component, and I'm only saying that in terms of the Adderall use, which doesn't matter. It's a legal drug. You're not supposed to sniff it, but he's not smoking crack. You know what I mean? He did. He was a coke user back in the day, but whatever. But he's much more than just active addiction. He's pathological, like you just said. I mean, he was a bad seed from the time he was a kid, and everybody knew it, and they covered it up, right? He wasn't bright. He perhaps has some learning disabilities that his family saw shame in, of which there is none. But instead of giving him help, they sent him to boarding school or military school. They paid somebody else to take his test instead of doing the cognitive therapy it would take to learn how to read properly. You know, they saw it as a weakness. And I think that dovetailed with his own innate pathology. You know, I think he's part omen. You know, he's just like a bad seed. And like you just said, you know, real strength is showing vulnerability. Like a real man isn't afraid to be intimate with his loved ones and his wife and his brother, or cry on a brother's shoulders. And, you know, that's real strength. Real strength showing vulnerability and caring for others. He views that as a weakness. And I don't know if it's his own. I think it's a variety of factors. I think his dad was obviously probably a piece of work, you know, and I think he's scared of his own emotions and scared of feeling things, which is, it goes into the, you know, hey, I got the biggest yacht, or I got the biggest building, or I got the hottest blonde next to me. You know, all these things that insecure men use to impress other men. Because you know this, you're a guy. There's guys who love women and sort of keep it to themselves, right? And there's you know what I mean? There's sort of the, you know, kind of poonhound, old school womanizer ladies man, which I was in my younger days, I'll admit, you know what I mean? And then there's guys who only hook up with a girl so they can immediately tell another guy about it, right? Because they're trying to look bigger in the other guy's eyes, which is the lowest form of misogyny. And that's who Trump is. That's why, like the Stormy Daniels thing, you know, the next day he's on the golf course. Hey, look at these bazungas. Look who I hooked up with last night, a porn star. You know, it's that kind of schmuck, a guy who never grew out of the ninth grade immaturity that we all know comes from dudes who are scared of women, essentially, right? They're trying to display their prowess to other men. And most people grow out of that stuff, you know, especially when they have, you know, daughters of their own and wives and, you know, you don't need that, but some semblance of emotional maturity where you're like, I don't need to be an asshole. I can look at a pretty girl without telling somebody that she's my conquest. You know what I mean?
And many of these sexual encounters, trysts that Donald Trump has had throughout his married life, is it fair to say that in most cases that's how he views them, as conquest? That here's somebody that maybe might have shown a little resistance to the idea, and he might not be 100% sure if he could bed, so he's going to prove to everybody that he can.
Yes, absolutely. It's all like kind of sort of trophy hunting for him with his adult predation, right? With Marla Maples, you know, with E. Jean Carroll, who he clearly knew and he clearly assaulted in, you know, in Bergdorf Goodman's and clearly was found guilty of this year. There's a darker, sicker side where he likes to beat up and mess with girls that look like his daughter. And that's where it really gets gnarly. And that's where I open my mouth wide and scream from the rafters. Because I worked with him around the pageants, too. I saw that side of him in the 90s. You know, Miss Teen USA. Think about that for a minute. Think about a grown-ass man pitching a show to NBC or whatever network and saying, hey, I'm going to do this spin-off from Miss Universe, which is already my property. On this one, we'll call it Miss Teen USA, and we'll judge the hottest 15-year-old in a bikini, right? That's another world that kind of crap was green-lighted on, but that was Donald Trump's world, and he would brag about the contestants. He would inspect them on stage. Friends of mine that were cameramen and stuff would, like, throw up in their mouths. They'd go home and tell their wives, like, you won't believe what a pig this guy was, you know? And people will often say, well, why didn't you stop him? It's like he owned the pageant. He was shooting it in a building with his name on it, or a casino with his name on it. His daughter was hosting the freaking thing, as she did in Corpus Christi at 15 years old, you know? And he had a bunch of NYPD cops on his security team. Who are you going to tell, right? So that was his public life. Let me just make one more point. Privately, the Epstein stuff I know is all true. And I don't know it because it was there, but I know a woman who was there, you know, and she started getting groomed by Donald Trump. And here's your thing that I've never talked about publicly on a podcast, you know. When she was 12, I think I've tweeted about it, but when she was 12, she was taking ice skating rinks. She grew up in New York. She was taking figure skating lessons at his rink in Central Park, and he started hitting on her. Beautiful woman, even as a girl. You know what I mean? and the kind that predators go after, looked older than her age, blah, blah, blah. She called him her dirty uncle. He was already flirting with 12-year-olds, as there's video of him doing in Trump Tower, by the way. He would hit on the schoolgirls that would use Trump Tower because there was a public restroom. So when school trips would come in to go to a museum or to watch the tree lighting or something, it was known fact that you could go use the public restrooms in Trump Tower. And he would go on the escalator and hit on the girls. He'd walk into the Starbucks and hit on kids, right? Think of how sick that is. I'm talking in his 40s and 50s. But anyway, he ended up sort of grooming to some extent this friend of mine. She made some bad choices in her own life, or, was victimized by other men, and it led to, things taking some bad turns, and ended up in Epstein's house, with Trump, and said, Noel, you wouldn't believe what these men did to women in this house, and I would believe it. I didn't push her for the details. That's all you need to tell me. It's not my story to tell. So when people say, why doesn't she come forward? Screw you. You know what I mean? Like, it's not your place to say that. And most of the women who've come forward haven't fared very well. You've seen, two heroes who did, but it doesn't mean the other ones aren't brave. They just know they're up against a big organization. And Epstein was offering those services to all kinds of rich dudes, not just Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was, not just his buddy, he was almost his mentor, because Trump already had a sex trafficking operation with Trump Model Management. That's basically what he was running in the early 90s. He was bringing women over from Eastern Europe, which is his flavor, right? He likes the blonde, Nordic, Slavic, Russian-looking chicks. He was bringing them over, offering them modeling contracts, right? They'd get here. He'd put them 6 to an apartment, sleeping on bunk beds on the Lower East Side. You can look all this up. Lucy Osborne, who's a reporter for the British Guardian, has a great series on it. I've spoken with her in the past. But he'd put them in these apartments, 6 girls in a sweaty apartment with no AC on the Upper East Side, and they'd have to work off their airfare, and their not tariffs, but whatever you call, the visa fees and your passport, and you take their passports. That's sex trafficking. You bring somebody into a foreign land and hold on to their passport until they work off their debt. That's white slavery. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's the nasty shit. And what he would do is bring those girls and parade them around to his business buddies at the Plaza Hotel. The Look Model of the Year was an event he had with John Casablancas, who he got his daughter a contract with when she was like 12, which is just, anybody who knows the modeling world in New York City back then, you don't bring your daughter into that world if you're a sane person, right? So he would do all of these things. He would collect compromise on people. He would use these women. Oh, you like brunettes? You like Asian girls? You like blondes? Go in the room, have a good time. And then he'd have a camera in there. And all of a sudden, the guy who's got to sign off on his building permits next week gets a call saying, hey, remember last Thursday at the Plaza? We were doing coke and having fun. There's a tape, do what I say. That's who Trump is. And that's why I talk about it, because you're not going to hear a lot of that in the mainstream media. It's too scary to go after. There's too many other people in that world. Epstein's thing was on East 71st Street. That's down the street from the Koch brothers at 740 Park Avenue. He's next door to Howard Lutnick, who owned Cantor Fitzgerald. He's got Bill Gates going there too, and Bill Clinton, in all fairness. And I was Clinton's escort. I like Clinton and the Clintons, but there's a lot of other people involved in that, and that was one of the services that Epstein was offering, right? Because you're a billionaire, and I'll shut up in a second. You're a rich.
Keep rolling.
Thank you, brother. You can walk into a bar. It's not going to be hard to meet a lady. Let's be honest, right? You're a big, famous, rich guy. You could probably go out in Palm Beach, hit the bars, and meet somebody, right? But those guys, they want to outdo each other, like I was saying before. They want the forbidden fruit, so to speak. They want the 14-year-old girl, that nobody, it's sick, but that's what they were doing. That's what Epstein was doing. And that's all documented. He went to jail for it in Palm Beach, got a sweetheart deal from Alex Acosta, who let him out of jail during the day so he could go back to his mansion, continue to do the same thing, which was prey on girls in West Palm Beach, which is the poorer cousin of Palm Beach. They'd come and give him a massage and a hand job or whatever. And then he'd go back to jail at night. That was that's all fact. Alex Acosta got put into the Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration for playing ball. And then he was the only head to roll when Epstein finally got popped and then whacked by Bill Barr. And, you can't prove that, but I'll go to my grave telling you that's how that went down,
you said forbidden fruit. You're talking about how they're trying to outdo one another. And as you said that, I was thinking, my God, that is the ultimate forbidden fruit for more than one reason. One, it's illegal, right? And that involves then the moral and ethical aspect of it. So it's as sick as it sounds, but I understand it. It's one way of not only saying to another guy, but showing him, my balls are bigger than yours,
Right.
because look, you're too big of a pussy to go for this.
Right.
I'm not.
Right.
And that's how those guys think.
100%. And that's what Epstein was offering. He had a playground. That's what Epstein's Island was. That's what his place on East 71st Street was, a brothel, man. It was a billionaire's brothel. And it was also a compromat factory, and he was working with the Russians and all these other guys. And that's my hood, Carnegie Hall. I'm Carnegie Hill, rather. 93rd and 5th is, that's where I lived in the city for, a couple decades. I'm heading there after the podcast. So I know this neighborhood. I know him. He used to come around. I used to do the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremonies for like 20 years. And he would come around with Ghislaine Maxwell and Melania and like this Naomi Campbell. You remember her?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is back in the day. It was an inside baseball event in the Waldorf, and you'd buy a table for $10,000, and it was like going to a wedding where you saw a bunch of rock stars. Now it's a big TV show, which I did too, but this is before that. But anyway, he was allowed to get away with that, is the point I'm getting, because he showed up and gave money to charities. He had this public facade, and so did Trump. Even though Trump wasn't accepted by the old money, he was still a famous guy in New York City, right? And famous guys and rich guys, no matter how much he lied about his wealth, he was still a substantially wealthy guy. He still is, And people say he's not a real billionaire. It's a funny punchline. He's got a lot of property. He's got a lot of equity. So, not cash, but whatever. He's a rich guy. My point being, if you're a rich guy, banks want to do business with you, right? Lawyers want to do business with you. Other Wall Street firms want to do business with you. So when you get into that tangle, that web of the infrastructure of wealth, you're going to be protected by the other people, because they don't want anybody coming and pulling on that string and having that sweater unravel, right? Your other builders. Your Richie Lafrax, who's his buddy, all those guys in the Hamptons, these really billionaire class New Yorkers, they all know Trump was a scumbag. That's also part of my world that I've had access to. Not that I'm a rich guy. I've been in a lot of rooms and people don't think I was paying attention, and I was always listening. That was part of my gig in TV. You're the talent guy. I kind of blend up against the wall, and people say and do things in front of me thinking I'm not paying attention. Right. And I got a mind like a steel trap. It's one of the weird. I can remember what I wore to school in 3rd grade. I have like a photographic memory for that shit. So I'll always remember, I remember that day and what you said, and so that's how it works. Do you see what I'm saying? That's how
I do.
Especially if you got law enforcement on your side. We had a crooked mayor. Giuliani was his guy forever. Bill Bratton, you know what I mean? There's another New York commissioner. His name is escaping me right now. He's Ray Kelly. All these guys, they're part of the firmament of New York. And then Trump would have Keith Schiller and these ex-NYPD guys as security. So you're not coming up against that. And if you're a victim of him, if he does something to you in his limo after going to a nightclub or something, and you finally get out of that room, and then some big hulking security guy's like, nothing happened. Here's an envelope. Here's some cash. Right. Here's an NDA. A lawyer will call you tomorrow. Keep your mouth shut. And you're already traumatized. That's what happened. Greg Kelly is Ray Kelly's son. He raped a woman. He was a Fox News host in New York City, raped somebody and basically got away with it because his dad was the police commissioner. Total scumbag. And I don't like scumbags, man. And no. I don't care how rich and powerful you are. I'm going to open my mouth. Come after me. Come after me. Not saying I want to get sued. I can't defend myself. But because people sometimes talk about it like it's sport. I wish you would sue Noel. I don't want to get sued, I don't wish that shit. I don't have a high fancy lawyer, but the truth on my side, and that's what they fear, because he knows who he is. He knows, and I don't get. What are you going to take from me? I don't have anything. I got some guitars. You know what I mean? I got a couple leather jackets. What are you going to take from me?
That's the maybe the strength, I suppose, that, at least mental, that I have on my side. I don't have anything.
Right.
So come at me. You're not going to, you can get some books, or you know what I mean. So yeah.
And that's a serious asset. On a serious note, when you're not motivated by money, these guys get scared of you. And I'm not motivated by money. I got enough. I don't care. It's not what motivates me. Whatever time I have left, I want to enjoy my life and help other people. I don't care about, I don't need a fancy car. I don't need any of that crap. And that freaks those guys out, because most people are motivated by money, and that's how you control people. That's what we see in the media ecosphere. That's why Trump has been as strong as he is, because he knows people are making a buck off him, most especially on the nightly news and the cable news and stuff. He knows you're going to talk about his trial for 4 months every day. You're going to put his brand front and center because you're making a buck off it. And he's always wielded that power over the press and a certain element in New York State and now the entire country.
Let me ask you, I'll go with this one first. How would you describe his relationship with Ivanka?
Man, well, that's the heart of the matter. That's creepy as hell. And I was Ivanka's handler. I call her Vanky, I was his handler. And I love to talk about this shit. First of all, he's unnaturally attracted to her and has been since she was a girl. There's that famous photo of him squeezing her hand. He was bringing her to the Look Model of the Year awards. She looked like she was 10. She may have been 12. She was very young. That was the Casablancas thing that I referenced before. They have a big contest every year to find like the hottest model, and they'd have a gala dinner. And Trump would show up at that dinner with his daughter as his date, which is already creepy and already had tongues wagging in society. But he's a famous guy. He's Donald Trump. Maybe it's just cute. To me, it's creepy AF, right? And to most people, so, he puts her on a pedestal and worshipped her, and we all know he'd publicly talk about having sex with her and stuff like that. I don't think he that's out of my wheelhouse, so I won't say to that. My guess is he didn't. But, I've seen her give him a lap dance and do kind of weird shit, as we've all seen. There's the famous photo of her at Mar-a-Lago in the short shorts on top of him. By the way, that's at a Beach Boys concert. She was like 14. So it was like 1990 something, 94, 96, how many girls at that age were into the Beach Boys in the early 90s? You know what I mean? Right? Like, it's that, oh man, I just got to grind on something because this is my kid.
Can I go see my club?
Right, exactly. Right?
Yeah.
So that the whole thing, and you see the other couple giving him side eye. There's a woman and a guy who are clearly uncomfortable sitting next to that. So he would do that sort of thing, is my point, and say the inappropriate comments. And what I observed around her was that she would work it to get what she wanted from her dad, because she's a party girl. She was a model at a young age. She got kicked out of basically a prep school in Manhattan and had to go to Choate up here in Connecticut. I'm right near the Connecticut border. And her dad gave her an SUV so she could still drive into the city and go to clubs at night during your school week. And this is fancy prep school. I mean, this is, top echelon type schools. So she still wanted to be a party girl, and she had daddy wrapped around her finger, right? When I came into the picture more prominently, it was as her escort on Celebrity Apprentice. And by then you had Jared Kushner in the picture. And here's what I observed. She was running the show. Jared Kushner were running the show, right? Because Trump doesn't have a long game. As we discussed, with his pathologies, he's got a big hole inside of him. He wants music to play when he walks in the room. He wants to get high, and he wants to hit on women, right? He wants an immediate, need filled pathologically with just what's in front of him, right? Ivanka and Jared have a long game. They saw how they could make money off of this. They walked out of the White House with $640 million and a $2 billion contract from KSA the week after he left, even though Jared had no previous institutional investment experience, right? Oh, I'm opening a hedge fund, and all of a sudden the KSA Sovereign Wealth Fund is cutting you a $2 billion check. That shit doesn't happen, okay? High finance is a skilled occupation, and there's a lot of guys who are really good at it with a lot of degrees in it, more than an over, Jared Kushner, right? But so he got to pay off because they were playing the long game. And when I saw her speaking voice, first of all, is lower than what you hear. That breathy, cooey, sibilant S sound.
Yeah.
That's what her dad likes to hear. And that sort of mollifies her dad. She uses that to get what she wants out of him, to purr at him and sort of come out in this semi-erotic, very creepy fashion. And then you see her behind the scenes barking at her assistants, and she sounds like a sailor from Queens with a lower octave voice. And, you know? And there's a clip on Conan. Your viewers can look it up. There's a clip where she slipped into her normal speaking voice. But so her whole image is like crafted by him, and she went along with that. Like her whole, I'm not knocking anybody for changing their looks, but she had radically changed her face and all parts of her body by the time she was out of her teens, and has continued to do it as an adult. And she's not alone in that. I'm not judging it, but it would be creepy to think like my dad wants me to look like a Barbie doll and he's willing to pay for it, and I'm going to look like a Barbie doll for daddy. Right. And behave like a Barbie doll for daddy. Sure. So, it's probably one of the creepier relationships that we've ever seen in public life. She could certainly bury him. She never would, because she's getting her own stuff out of it. She hates her brothers. They hate her. It's like a den of vipers. That family, they all hate each other. Trump hates his sons, as everybody else does. How can you not? You know what I mean?
Is it fair to say that Don Jr. and Eric are jealous as hell of?
Oh, yeah. And Don Jr. used to be kind of a drunk, right? I think he's a cokehead again now. When I worked around them, they were dry. But in his drunk days, like, he got his ass kicked at the Comedy Cellar. He got kicked out of there for being drunk, getting in a fight, knocked a beer onto somebody's girlfriend and, got beat up, which isn't cool. I don't condone violence, but he was a bad drunk is my point, right?
Right.
Well, he would talk smack about his sister out in nightclubs, revealing secrets about her to try and hit on girls and stuff, so they definitely hate each other. Don Jr. is like, I used to make this joke that like the Dalai Lama would meet him and be like, man, I just really want to punch that guy in the face.
I know. Yeah.
I just want to, just the Pope would be like, let me just uncrack, and I'll go back to it being spiritual. He's just that guy. And Eric Trump's just a moron. You expect to see him in the corner with a ball of yarn. I called him Twizzlers because he would steal all the Twizzlers off the craft service table when we were shooting the finales. Which is the other thing, is that they're supposed to be billionaires and they would collect per diems. They would grift things from a production that the kids of billionaires wouldn't do. I live in a town that's got a bunch of billionaires in it, right? They're all riding dressage horses. I live in horse country on a little horse farm. I don't have any horses, but I got bridle trails in my yard. It's a fancy horse town, right?
Yeah.
A lot of billionaires' kids. A very famous billionaire lives next door to me. His daughter has riding rings the size of the Olympics. You know what I mean? If you're a billionaire's kid, you're riding dressage horses, you're sailing catamarans off in Newport, you're racing F1 cars in Monaco. You're not working on a game show to judge who has a better pop-up shop in Times Square, Meatloaf or Little John, right? You're nowhere near that shit. You're set for life. So these kids would show up and grift. They would do all these grifts about ads, and there's a new book about it. Suzanne Craig and Russ Butner, I always say his name wrong, have a new book out about The Apprentice and what a bunch of crap it was,
Right.
It was all a scam. It was all a way to grift money, and his kids were into that too. And that always struck me. When I worked with him was obviously before he became president or even ran, but it was like, something's not right here. These guys aren't a billionaire if he's taking the Twizzlers and the power bars off the craft service table. You know what I mean?
Right. Let's talk about his hair. What's up with that shit on top of his head? What
the dead ferret, as I like to call it. Well, first of all, this may surprise some of your viewers, but it's real. It's his real natural hair. It's dyed. I tell people this: if you saw him getting out of a shower before he was made up, you would never vote for him again. You could be the most hardcore MAGA guy, and if you saw what that dude looks like au natural, you'd be like, oh, hell no. Hell no. I'm voting for Hillary. I'm voting Harris. Walls. I don't care. Get that thing away from me, right? So what it looks like is, you remember Riff Raff?
Oh, yeah.
Remember Rocky Horror Picture Show when he had those long things? So that's what Trump has. He had a scalp reduction on top of his head. And that's when he famously, assaulted the mother of his children. He raped his first wife because she sent him to a plastic surgeon to get a scalp reduction, and he didn't like the results. So this is all in her divorce testimony. She later rescinded it, but she said it under oath once. It's good enough for me. You know what I mean?
Right.
So he thought it left a horrible scar, and he said, "You've ruined my life." So he ripped a chunk of her hair out and forced himself on her, the mother of his kids. That's the kind of man he is, because he was so thinking he was screwed now because he wasn't going to have this hair that he dreamed about. So that's what he lives with. So it's a scalp reduction. So then he's like pattern baldness, right? He's like bald on top and the back, but he lets the sides go really long, and then he swirls them up in like this pompadour and uses like Aquanet, like a can of Aquanet. There's a hole in the ozone layer that he's responsible for. You know what I mean? So he swirls it up. He does it himself. It takes about an hour. He does his own face stuff. I'd never seen him doing this. I know the brand he uses. It's from Swiss Arts. It's called Bronx Concealer, I think number 5. And it's that ruddy orange hue. I think he might put those little things when you're in a tanning bed to cover your eyes. I was
wondering.
Right. I think he might those on and then just does one of these, though I haven't seen that, with my own eyes, but that's what I assume. But he does that look. And that's why when he was president, he wouldn't show up in the Oval Office every day till noon. He would sit up, snort Adderall to get going, watch Fox and Friends, and then take an hour and a half, 2 hours to put on his pompadour, his fake hair, or whatever, his creation, and his makeup. Think about that for a second. The guy's got the most important job in the world, You should be at that desk at 7 a.m. sharp, if not earlier. You got all kinds of things waiting for you every day of the week for the 4 years you're in that chair. This guy's not showing up till noon. He spent 305 days on a golf course out of 4 years. He spent a year on the golf course. It cost $144 million for him to go golfing.
So question about on the Adderall, because when I was a kid, I had ADHD.
Right.
Bad. I took Ritalin. I took Adderall. I tried most of them, right? Doing that much Adderall, and in the way he was taking it, would he then later have a period where he just crashed like a fucking truck into a tree?
Yeah, he needs a come down, so he takes benzos. So it's a combination. It's the Adderall up when he's got to speak in public, when he's got to read, when he's got to get going, and then it's the benzos to come down at night. Which is, I'm a former, as I said, recovering alcoholic. There's powders and pills in my story, and that's what you do. You go up, and then you're like, shit, it's 2 a.m. I got to come down now. So you take a benzo. That's why sometimes if you see him, he's slurring his words and he seems really out of it. He doesn't travel well. He's a homebody is the other thing. He's not somebody who really enjoys traveling, which a lot of addicts don't, right? Because you're out of your routine. You have your stuff and you know how to get away with it. And all of a sudden you're in a hotel in London and it gets sketchy and the time changes. So he manages his own chemistry that way. And that's very much part of his addiction. He's also like, the I don't drink is a self-made myth. He's not a boozer. It's not his drug of choice. Both of his brothers were alcoholics. It runs in his family. No judgment. It runs in my family too. So he's scared of booze, and I think stimulants make him feel in control. I did a show with him, VH1, where he was sniffing coke in the back of a limo with a bunch of models. VH1 Fashion Awards, probably 2002. Blew off Melania, went out with a bunch of models afterwards. My buddy's the transportation guy. He got in a limo and he wouldn't move. And if you do one of these shows, when you're doing outs, you keep the cars moving, right? A town car pulls up, you throw Madonna in it. Another one pulls up, you throw John Legend in it. You keep it moving. He wouldn't move the limo because he's trying to cut lines with these models. And my buddy's like, dude, move it on. And he's looking through the window, clearly seeing what he's doing, which isn't unusual. And it's only anecdotal. Sure. And, whatever. I don't need to prove that to anybody. Right. I'm just painting the picture of who he is. So he was a guy who spent a lot of time in nightclubs. He'd order a light beer now and then. There's a Vice article about him doing that. He'd get served. You hand him a glass of wine, he'd take a sip or something. So that whole I'm a teetotaler thing that he uses in his defense is bogus. And it's one of these self-made myths that the media repeats. I'm not saying he's a boozer. He's a drinker, but I think he hides behind that. He doesn't even drink kind of bullshit. So what? You can not drink and shoot heroin every fucking day. You know what I mean? Like, so what? It's a different drug. It doesn't mean you're a teetotaler,
And I would assume, and maybe not, maybe he's good enough that he slips away for long enough that this isn't the case. But I would assume that in the last 8-9 years, there have been Secret Service agents who have seen him using illicit drugs. I mean,
no
about
doubt,
half to it.
no doubt about it. And I've heard tale to that effect. I can't get more into it than that,
Sure.
just because it's not my story to tell. I don't want to throw anybody else under the bus. But I know people that are close to some people in that orbit, and they've told me, yeah, dude, I've heard some things. And as a matter of fact, there was a guy who wrote me, this was in 2020, and he said he was either an Air Force medic or a naval medic, but he said he was stationed. I had no way to verify it, but he was in the White House, medical facility. Downstairs in the White House, they have a full, operating room. Like, they can do whatever they need to do down there in an emergency. And he claimed to be on that staff. And he said there was all kinds of drug abuse going on, which we've now seen semi-corroborated by the doctor, the guy who ran for Congress. His name is escaping. Ronnie Jackson, right?
Ronnie Jackson.
So Ronnie Jackson was handing out, Demerol and Ativan like it was candy, and Ambien and all kinds of crazy shit. Special K, there was ketamine. And this guy wrote me a letter and said, look, this stuff is going on. You need to find somebody else who can, who can bring this story to light, because no one's going to believe a comedian, obviously. And I'm under all kinds of oaths and whatever. I can't break the news. So I'm only telling it to you anecdotally. But I'd heard that in 2020, that it's crazy down there. And we all saw when he went running off to Walter Reed and he was carrying stuff. He came out of the side door on a Saturday. That's not Trump. He doesn't carry anything himself. So whatever was happening right there, he was in a lot of distress to be carrying his own files and his own papers or whatever he was doing. And I know for a fact that he was in New York City 2 Saturdays before that Saturday at a UFC fight at Madison Square Garden. And I tried to get people to pick this story up. They wouldn't. And he was with a known associate from the Apprentice days who was well versed in the powder arts, if you catch my grift.
I do.
He was backslapping the president, and Trump's kids were there, and Secret Service was outside the perimeter. They were allowing this to happen. This guy also happens to be a known felon, which in my day, if you had a record, you weren't getting anywhere near the president. And I knew a lot of good people on the Secret Service, but he got a lot of people to bend the rules in his administration. And I'm not indicting all the Secret Service, but there was clearly some bad shit going on. Some of the guys were having affairs with his daughters, and Don Jr.'s wife had an affair. Apparently Tiffany did. No judgment, but that's way beyond the pale. You don't do that kind of stuff if you're in law enforcement on the job. And I'll say one story. When I saw that picture at Secret Service, with the Secret Service allowing him, on the floor of the Garden at a UFC fight, which is already insane. If you think of it from a security perspective, that's already bending the rules. Because back in the day, we're not taking you into a room with 20,000 guys jacked up on creatine who all think they're mixed martial artist champion. That's just a nightmare in and of itself, right?
Right.
That's just no, we're skipping that event. When I did both of President Obama's inaugurations, and I did the balls, right? So I handled the band. So you're taking all these bands around, and I love this band. This doesn't reflect poorly on them. Chris Cornell is one of my favorite singers of all time. He was the singer in Soundgarden. He's no longer with us. But so I was assigned to Soundgarden that night. Oh, wow. And we had to do a move, right? So at one point in the evening, Chris Cornell was singing at the Commander-in-Chief Ball, which is, all the military generals, the head honcho. It's the most serious one. It's the first one of the night. So Chris was singing there by himself, and then I had to move, but the whole band had to come with him because it was logistically, it was on the top floor of this convention center, and then we had to go down the basement in an elevator, big service elevator. And it was an interesting night because Chris's guitar wasn't plugged in, and I'm standing on the side of the stage, and he goes out there to perform, and the guitar's not coming over the thing. And the guitar tech's next to me is like, can I run out there and check it? And I'm like, brother, you run out there right now, you're getting shot. The president sat down in the first row, we ain't moving. Chris is on his own. And Chris just steps away from the microphone to get the balance right and fills the room with his voice and sang that Creedence Clearwater song, leave a candle in the window. I mean, it was one of the most powerful things I'd ever seen.
Oh,
Dude
shit,
filled
I
up
bet.
that room like Pavarotti. It gave me the chills. Everybody in the room. Badass artist, that guy. I love him. So anyway, so we had to do this complicated move. I'm with the rest of the band, and the Secret Service runs stuff on everybody who's in that building. You're part of the talent and part of the crew. They've done a full background check on you, or you're not getting anywhere near that place. So they came up to me and they said, look, one of the guys, that they've hired for security, and this is no offense to that guy, he has a prior. He got in a bar fight 30 years ago in the Northwest or something. You know what I mean? Simple
Sure.
prior, but it got flagged on his record. They said he can work all he wants on the first floor. You can't bring him upstairs to the commander-in-chief's ball. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a level of security, and like that dude ain't getting on the elevator. And I had to tell this guy that, and he hated me. You know what I mean? He was like, "What do you mean?" Like he hated me. And I was at it. Soundgarden invited me to a concert they were doing in Manhattan a few nights later, and I go backstage to say hi to the band, and I saw that guy again. He's like, you again? Fuck you. But my point being, that was the rules, and you didn't bend them. You weren't going to override the Secret Service. And Trump has clearly overridden the Secret Service. And he's clearly got a different style of Secret Service than I or any of us have ever seen. And we don't have to get into it, but Pennsylvania, like, that doesn't pass the smell test. There's just no way. Yeah.
And I've said this, I've used this example. Look, if you've got a 21-year-old son, and let's say we're back in the 40s, right?
Right.
And you send your son really needs a job, and you send your 21-year-old son to be a bodyguard for Al Capone.
Right.
And your son is a straight-laced kid, good grades, but he's with Al Capone for 6 fucking years.
Right.
You're not getting the same kid coming back to you that you sent to work. We are influenced by the people we are around most of the fucking time. We just are. And you can't tell me that a detail that is protecting a guy who hates to be told no, and pushes against everything, they have had to recalibrate their value system. They have had to look at the protocol for different things that the Secret Service, there's no wiggle room, but they've created wiggle room. They've had to have. You couldn't work for the guy or protect the guy. He'd have you gone. You'd be replaced. That's my guess.
That's a perfect analogy. That's exactly how it happens. And before Trump was president, he had 40 years of that kind of thing. He'd get a guy who was a relative straight shooter, NYPD, ex-sergeant, you know what I mean? And you come into his orbit, you're doing security for him at night. All of a sudden, he's doing you a favor like he did for Tony Ornato, I believe, at Secret Service, helped him get a mortgage on a bigger house. So you're from a chain command hierarchy thing. A lot of the Secret Service are ex-military. I went to high school with one of the guys. He was a Marine, serves with distinction as a Secret Service, and he ends up on Trump's detail. He was the guy who Trump tried to choke in the back of his limo. I haven't spoken with the guy. I don't know what he transferred out of D.C. after January 6th, but we saw that those guys deleted texts after January 6th. They weren't tripping over themselves to testify in front of the House. They kept their mouths.
They weren't.
And I'm not indicting these people necessarily. What I'm saying is what you just so eloquently said, is that you come from a hierarchical background. Here's this guy, he's commander-in-chief. He's been schmoozing you for 4 years. You're the best. And when I leave here, I'm taking you with me, man. I wish they were all like you. How you doing, buddy? Because Trump's a bullshit artist. This is the thing people don't get. He can be charming. I know your viewers may not believe this, but they're wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. They see the guy they hate, and we all hate sort of on Twitter because he's a threat to democracy. But one-on-one, he has a certain schmoozing ability. He's famous. He knows it, especially those kind of guys who come from a cop background, a working class background. He fits the mold, right? He's a billionaire. He loves this country. So if you're just what you said, if you're doing the right thing and following the protocol on year one, by year 3 and 4, you've crossed a line. You don't really realize it. And usually what happens is once you cross those lines, you're in jeopardy too. And somebody reminds you of that and says, hey, that nice big house you have? Those kids are going to Duke next year that I wrote a letter for? You want to pay that tuition? You want to continue with this nice life, or you want to go up against this? And all your comrades, so to speak, are going for it because you're in the culture now. And a lot of those guys also politically buy the BS that the left's out to get them, that, it was like the whole thing. I'll shut up, but like how they were able to demonize Biden with the Let's Go Brandon. Biden is one of those dudes. The guy's from Pittsburgh. He wrote the freaking crime bill in the early 90s. He's as law and order, working class, old school American scoutmaster kind of dude as you're ever going to meet. If he was corrupt in D.C., don't you think they would have figured it out in the 50 years he was in D.C. before he became president? If he was running a criminal operation, you think he's going to Rehoboth Beach in Delaware? You think he's sitting on a beach that you could afford to go to, or I could? He's
riding the subway into work every day.
Right, exactly. Took a train. I mean, he's a mensch. He's a good dude. He's a straight shooter. He's a solid guy. And the fact that they were to get so many Americans to turn against a guy like that shows you the kind of hold Trump has with people. And you said it best. It's a cultural thing. I don't want to go against my community. I don't want to get left out in the cold.
It is. And, I've gotten into this debate with people on social media before. I'll post something about Trump's charisma, and people say, he doesn't have any fucking charisma. And I say, look, some of the most evil people in history, as much as we hate them and as much of an evil bastard as they were, Adolf Hitler was a charismatic dude.
Yeah.
That's what made him so dangerous.
Right.
Same thing, Donald Trump. I'll tell you a real quick story. A guy that I know who was a hardcore Republican. Hardcore, right? He didn't want to, if it was Democrat, he didn't even want to turn his head that way. But he was in a position where he met both, not at the same time, but he met Bill Clinton and he met Barack Obama on separate occasions. It wasn't like he engaged in an hour conversation with them, but a few minutes, I think. And he told me this, and I'll never forget it. Now, again, this is a guy who hated everything about what they represent. And he said, I'll tell you something. He said, both of those guys, he said, it was like something came from them and just engulfed me, this warm feeling. And he said, I would have done any fucking thing they asked me to do for them. Yep. He said, it's incredible. He said, that is charisma.
Yes.
And he said, that's something that doesn't come through the TV screen like it emanates from them when you are within that sphere.
That absolutely correct. I know I've met both of those former presidents. I was Bill Clinton's escort for many years in New York when he'd come to the Carnegie Hall to do an event or something. I'd be his guy. And he'd always make you feel like you were the only guy in the room. And he'd see me backstage, and there'd be like Elton John, Lady Gaga or something. He'd see me across the room and be like, hey, bud, how you doing? I'll be over in a minute to talk to you. And then he'd come over and he'd hit on a makeup artist next to me. He'd use me as a tool to hit on somebody, It was just like how he was, and you loved him. I met Barack Obama President Obama 2 days before the inauguration. We did a big concert on for HBO, and it was on the mall at Lincoln Memorial and stuff. And he decided he and Michelle wanted to meet all the performers and thank them after the gig. And I'm in the department that did all the logistics, one of the team that did it. So we got to be in that room too. I was like, I'm getting in that tent. You know what I mean?
Right.
I want to see what goes down. And he gave a great speech. This is President Obama. And then he said, I want to thank everybody personally. And we all lined up. And when he shook my hand and said, how you doing? His hand felt like velvet. It was like the warmest hand. It just enveloped me. And he just leaned in and said, how you doing? And I would have taken a bullet for that guy.
Right.
I was like, and I'd never met him before. I voted for him, but I was just like, oh my God. You know what I mean? And
Right.
it's the same thing, and people, I get the same reaction on Twitter. They don't know what they're talking about because they hate the guy, but they're not willing to see the complexity. And it's the multifaceted nature of him that is dangerous. And he is correct. And it doesn't necessarily transfer on camera. But when you meet him in person, he's a big guy. He does have a big aura about him. He knows how to play the show. So if you're coming at him and meeting him there and you've seen him on TV for 40 years and you're partial to it, you'll get swept up in that.
And let me ask you about that, because clearly, and I've heard other people say this, he is a big guy.
Yeah.
What what's the deal on shoe lifts? Yes or no?
Yes. No, he wears them. He wears them. It's that same insecurity. The guy's naturally 6'1". I'm 5'7", and people don't believe me. I'll say, hey, I'm 5'7". They're like, no, you're not. I'm like, you can't give me 5'7". You
Right.
can't give me 5, right? Like,
Yeah.
that, so if I'm 6'1", I'm good all day. I'm good at 5'7",
Right.
to be honest with you. But he's 6'1", but needs to be on 6'3". And he does wear shoe lifts. They're Cuban heels. They're big heels on the back of it.
Yeah.
There may be some inserts in there too. I did see a picture of one of his shoes after Pennsylvania, and there was like an insert on the ground.
Yes.
And you clearly heard him say, let me get my shoes. So that's
Sure.
what he's thinking, right? Let me get my shoes so when I stand up, I'm going to be my camera height. I'm not going to be my getting out of the shower height. That's what the guy's thinking about when somebody's apparently shooting into a crowd and there's 100 of his followers sitting behind him, one of which is no longer alive.
Right.
And the fact that they let him, I don't want to get into that too much, but the fact that they let him do all that is like, what?
That's something, Noel, that has bothered me for a long time. I know a gentleman named Mark McClish, who is a former Secret Service agent, and he and I used to collaborate a little bit on books and ideas related to his expertise. And he told me a few stories. He was in the Reagan era, right? And here's what I knew going into seeing this assassination attempt. I knew that there's no way in hell a competent Secret Service is going to let somebody they are protecting stand up.
Right.
They're not. That head is going to be down, and every place they move, his head will be at their waist level.
Yep.
No bones about it.
100%.
I've gone back and reviewed the footage of that after they stood him up on that stage. There are at least 3 different time periods of 5 seconds each, so 15 seconds, where there's at least a 2 to 3 foot gap between any Secret Service agent and his head. And right then, let me ask you this question, because let's just go with the idea that these 2 assassination attempts are legit, right? We do know 2 men are dead from the first one. That's not questionable. I haven't heard enough about this second one yet to really be able to speak to it. My question for you is, Donald Trump of the makeup and lack of integrity that if he thought he was falling so far behind in a race that an assassination attempt would boost him in the ratings, would he be beneath that in orchestrating something for his benefit? And again, I'm not asking you to say whether he did. We're going with both are legit, right? I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, is he somebody who would consider something like that for a boost?
He wouldn't give it a second thought. He would 100% do it and consider it and say, do it now. And I don't know enough about yesterday's thing to comment on it either. But I know he was on the ropes with the Taylor Swift stuff and with the Laura Loomer and losing the debate last week, that if it was a staged operation, yesterday would be when they were going to do it. And the thing you need to know about Donald Trump is you can't give him the benefit of the doubt on anything. He had a couple of his executives die mysteriously in a plane crash in 1989. They were involved with his casino operations, and they were under investigation, the casinos in the Trump organization, for laundering money. And word on the street was that these guys were cooperating, and all of a sudden he summons them to New York City to go to a press conference for a boxing event. Why do you need your CFO to come to a press conference in New York City for a boxing event, right?
Right.
Rents a helicopter. It goes down on in the Pine Barrens on the way home. One of their family members came to one of my shows in New York City years ago and said, I still blame him for the death of my kid. I still think he was behind it. And the investigation went away. So Trump's a guy with a long history of mob ties, and he doesn't care who has to get hurt to do business. That's just who he is. He's a pathological lie. Now you superimpose on that your Mike Flynn's, your Koch brothers, your Eric Prince, your Vladimir Putin, and those ties, which are all well documented. They certainly helped him in 2016. right? So you could theoretically have an operation. And like you, I'm not saying whether or not it happened. I definitely have my suspicions, and there's things that don't add up. And I will say this. If he had gone right to a hospital afterwards and a head surgeon from that local hospital came out and gave a press conference and said, I treated him, there was a nick on his ear, he's otherwise fine, blood pressure, vitals are fine, I would have bought the whole story. The fact that he didn't do that, that he went back to Bedminster, that he had Ronnie Johnson, Dr. Feelgood come and, deal with him and say he had a 2-centimeter hole in his ear. 2 centimeters is bigger than a penny, bro. You're not gonna tape a freaking napkin to the side of your head and show up at a debate or at a convention 3 days later.
Right.
So he would do that. He would view his followers as sacrificial lambs. Hey, somebody had to die for the cause. They're a martyr. Just the way he brought that guy's, jacket, helmet. It was disgusting.
It was creepy.
Disgusting. Yeah. It was like, you're using this. Most people who are in a situation like that would still be in trauma. They would have PTSD. I've seen.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have. It sticks with you, man. It messes, especially if it's directed at you or it happened right behind you. He had none of those normal human emotions. And I'll say one more thing, like you well said, I was a kid outside of D.C. when Reagan got attempted assassination. James Brady took a, nearly mortal wound that it took him decades to recover from. I saw that play out. I remember coming home from school and turning on the TV. They turned Reagan sideways. They took control and threw him into the limo, right?
They did.
You'd be carrying him like a log, like a battering ram. You'd go around the SUV. You wouldn't be letting him stand up once again on the side of the SUV and wave again. His head would not be in any kind of periphery where a second shooter, the way that somebody was like, shoot her down. How do you know there's only one shooter? We don't know that about JFK 70 years ago. You know what I mean?
Right.
6 years ago. Like, that was just none of it passed the smell test. And I think you're getting to him, Jack, because they had that clip that he constantly retweeted, and it did the fight, and then it showed the very awkward goose walk off of the stage, which was on his cue, and he put his hand forward.
Yes.
That was very awkward and not like the movements of trained people who were, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, I got probably half a dozen Secret Service numbers in my phone. I'm somebody who was on the periphery of that. I was Carter's escort in the 90s. I did 9/11 ceremonies where we had 5 presidents. I'm a novice who's been in the room and fascinated with security. I'm a guy who reads spy novels.
Sure.
So you're always like, hey, how could a shooter get us, And I was in the production staff, so we would be the guys who had to clear out of a building while they swept a building and bomb dogs and all this kind of stuff. And I've seen a few mistakes. I've seen a door go on, I no indictment of everybody, but that same inauguration I was telling you about it, Obama's second inauguration, we were in the ground floor of the convention center and we had like Taylor Swift and Katy Perry performing, and we had to stop so they could do a walkthrough. And from that point on, you could only come in the building through the mags, through this one point, so you could funnel everybody in, and no more amp cases or anything with some weird stuff was coming in. And right after it was locked down, I'm standing behind the stage in this long hallway, and a catering guy comes in a side door with a tray with a bunch of, sandwiches and dishes on it. And I just hit the next to me. I said, that guy just walked in the side of the door. And he was like, oh, shit, thanks. So, there is human error is my point. It's very hard to secure a large operation. And I'm not indicting those people as much as I'm saying, don't give that guy the benefit of the doubt, because he would do anything to stay out of jail. And that's what this election is really about. It's about not, having his house of cards fall down and having to pay back all this money and spend the rest of his days in jail or under indictment. I don't think he'll ever fall asleep in a cell, but, I think he's too old and he'll tie it up in the courts, and he's got a Supreme Court that's in his favor anyway. But that's what's at stake. Couple of guys behind him who are indispensable in his eyes, no problem. He'd do it hard.
And you mentioned the Reagan attempted assassination on President Reagan. If you go back and you look at, I think, if I'm not mistaken, didn't Ford have a couple of attempts on his life?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I have a personal connection to that. My grandmother, later in her career, was very good friends with his Secret Service agent who lived out in Beaver Creek. After Ford retired, he went out to Colorado, and I happened to live in Vail, and he was a lifetime, aide to Ford. So yeah, Ford had Squeaky Fromm, I believe, tried to kill him. you know?
Yes. So I guess here's my point. If we go back and historically look at every assassination attempt, and I'm talking about sitting presidents, of course, and this differs in that Trump's not currently a sitting president. However, after Kennedy coming forward, there were always policy changes. There were always structural changes to how things were done. And until those changes were implemented, there was a hold put on a whole lot of shit in terms of where people went and where they didn't go. It seems incredibly strange to me that after a very recent attempt on Donald Trump's life in Butler, where 2 people died, that they were already so relaxed that, fuck it, let's go play golf. We have nobody watching the fence line.
I got it. Very astute observation, Jack. And I'll tell you another story. From how I understand it is when there's a security breach, let alone an attempted assassination, the Secret Service then takes over. And you don't have any say in the matter as the president, right? You're now a function of their department. If shots ring out, they're in charge. You don't get to say, wait for me to put on my shoes or let me stand up and wave to my friends one more time. They take control and secure the situation. Same with policy and protocol. So I just told you that story about meeting President Obama in the tent, and we're taking selfies. I got the selfies. We were all just chilling. So later, this was January, right? He gets inaugurated. So later that year, as one of the shows I did was the tree lighting at the White House. So we take the tree lighting gig, and they're like, hey, you want to go back and do the tree lighting? I was like, hell yeah, I want to get another selfie with my man, Barack, dude. Yeah, I'm all over that. You know what I mean?
Right.
We go down to do the gig, and we think, we're going to get more selfies. We're going to be like, hey, what's up? Remember me? You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, it's just going to be chilling before we go on stage and they sing Jingle Bells or whatever, right? A week before we got there, some of your viewers and listeners may remember this, but a couple snuck into a party at the White House. State dinner, some random
picture taken.
Right, random couple made a fake, VIP credential or something, a White House credential, which they're very serious about. You have to give them back when you leave the grounds, the campus at the end of the day. But somehow they just walked in through this breach. As I said, things happen, and it makes the Secret Service look stupid. So that happened. The Secret Service got very mad, and I think kind of mad at Obama for embarrassing them. You know what I mean? For whatever happened, it was like, all right, we're in charge now. You're not having any other cocktail parties. This was a week or whatever it was, this was a week before we do the tree lighting. So we go down there thinking, all right, we're getting ready. The president's motorcade, it's filmed right behind the White House on the ellipse and stuff. So he gets in the motorcade and, goes out the front door and drives basically in through the backyard, right? So we're waiting for him to come in this tent, and we're all standing there like, I'll be here in a minute. Oh, cool. Get your camera ready. You know how I look. Got anything in my teeth? All of a sudden, Secret Service comes, and they zip up the tent we're in. They zip up the freaking tent and seal us into this tent. And we hear his motorcade come in. We hear the doors shut. We hear him saying hi to somebody, and we hear him take his seat. And then they unzip the tent and say, you guys can go about your business now. There was no getting near him again. There was no seeing where he was for a moment until he was secure. From the time he got out of his limo, which is bulletproof, to the time he got in his seat, which had bulletproof glass in front of it. That movement you were no longer privy to. And it didn't matter if you were on The Voice or a director of a TV show or whatever. They were now in charge. And that's what we're talking about. That has changed. He's playing Doral and somebody's sticking a gun through a fence. Like, how is that even possible, dude? How is that perimeter? How is that road open?
When you look at what has happened recently, I mean, it is no small thing when the head of the CIA, or not the CIA, the Secret Service, when the head of the Secret Service steps down, it is basically, I think, told you're going to step down, but however that worked, they're gone.
Yeah.
That's not a little thing. That's a huge thing. And from my understanding of business elsewhere in other industries, you don't just continue at business as usual when there's that kind of shift.
Right.
Things clamped down for a while. And the idea that this detail of his in Florida, I call it the rogue detail. Rogue just in that they don't seem to be directing things from a Secret Service directive priority. It seems to be Donald Trump directing things, because there's nothing about anyone in the Secret Service after an assassination attempt on him that could have looked at this situation where they were going to play golf and said, it's okay. Go ahead. Thumbs up. No way.
Right. No
but
way.
It happened.
In an
Right.
open carry state. In an open carry state where you can walk into a Walmart and buy an AR-15, you know?
Right. And
No.
that brings me to Keith Schiller. Now, Keith Schiller, you mentioned people who were shuttled out of D.C., right, just about the time the subpoenas started flying. And I read something in kind of preparing for this episode with you. I read something somewhere about Schiller being sent out of the D.C. area and being paid like $15,000 a month just to kind of be somewhere else. I remember right after Trump was elected, and there was the story that circulated, and I still see it come up from time to time, about Trump and Keith Schiller going into the doctor's office and basically robbing the place, right? They just went in, I think, took out whole filing cabinets related.
And photographs. And that's my wheelhouse. That's the Adderall guy. That doctor, Dr. Harold Bornstein, was a Dr. Feelgood on the Upper East Side. You know, if you're a rich white lady on Park Avenue, you can get whatever drugs you want. You can get all the Xanax and Valium and Adderall and whatever, Ambien, right? So he was a guy who serviced that industry. He was Trump's main physician, though the guy was a gastroenterologist and a drug dealer, essentially. Not trying to disparage him. You look at the guy. But Trump made him his main guy for decades, right? And he was the only guy that you could prove the Adderall story with. I sat down with a very famous journalist friend of mine, very famous, and we tried to, years ago, like, how do we make this story work? And we couldn't make it work without having the doctor's corroboration, who had the fear of death in him from Trump. So Trump gets elected. It's February of 2017. One of the first things he does is send Keith Schiller, who you were correct, the day Robert Mueller was appointed, also in 2017, I believe in May, they sent Keith Schiller out of D.C. and gave him a $15,000 a month stipend from the RNC, which I assume he's still getting because he disappeared. And he was Trump's body man for years. He was the guy who stood outside the door in Moscow when Trump was getting peed on by the prostitutes. That was his job. You know, he was a muscle. He was a rammer on the narcotics squad in the Bronx. And he walked up to Trump in court one day because, as I said earlier, Trump's been involved in 4,000 lawsuits, so he was no stranger to the New York City courthouses. And Keith walked up to him decades before and said, "You should hire me on your security team." And this guy's job was the rammer. He was the guy who busted in the door when they'd go in and find a stash house and grab the kilos of cocaine. So it's curious that he would walk up to Trump and give him his business card. It's almost as if product was disappearing that may have hurt some of Trump's associates, if you follow my drift.
I do.
You know, and this guy's like, "Oh, you should be on my team." And Trump took him on a probationary, hire, and then made him his main guy. I called him Wet Wipes because he's the guy who changed his diaper and all this stuff.
And I read that. Did I read that correctly, that Keith Schiller did, at least on one occasion, change Donald Trump's diaper?
He was the guy. I mean, I wouldn't be alive now if I actually saw somebody like sticking a wet wipe between Trump's buttocks, because I would have strangled myself. You know what I mean? I would have jumped this window. It wouldn't. I would have gouged my eyes out. I wouldn't have been able to live with that horror. But he's the guy who would bring him in the room after there was an obvious incident, and the only guy in the room, so he did something. You know, God bless him. But let me just finish that point though, because about his office. So the first thing Trump does is send that guy, Matty Calamari, and Alan Garton, who's a Trump Organization lawyer, and they went and stole the records and took him out of that guy's office, put him up against the wall, took the stuff, took the photographs. The guy famously said, "I felt raped, I felt violated, that they did this." You know, you never really heard from the guy again. They spooked him. He died in January, a week after January 6th, mysteriously in his home in Scarsdale. His family didn't say how he died, and they quietly took out an ad in the New York Times. right? He was
Right.
the final loose end on Trump's drug abuse, which isn't against the law, but it's very convenient. And back to your earlier point, Trump has a long history of people very conveniently dying around him.
Right. It's very Putin-esque.
Right. And 6 people died that night. We don't have time to get into all that, but 6 Russian nationals died the night Trump got elected. One of them got beaten to death in the Russian consulate, which is around the corner from my place in New York City, East 91st Street, between Madison and 5th, which is 20 blocks north of where Epstein ran his compromat factory. So if you were doing compromat and trade-off handoffs in the middle of the night at a park bench in the dark along 5th Avenue, that's a very convenient place to do it. And that consulate was known as the spy agency in the Soviet Union era and later in the Russian era. It was like the dark arts New York City office. So,
And correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't hear with these 6 Russian nationals that you said wound up dying. We didn't hear much about that in the media, did we?
no.
I don't recall.
No, because you can't get to the bottom of it. And NYPD opened a case and tried to figure out how this guy, who was basically the guy at the front door, from my understanding, he was the security guard. Like when you get buzzed in the door, he was the guy who stood there. And he was a diplomatic guy. He was on the staff of the Russian embassy, and he got beat to death. And the NYPD opened a case, but they couldn't get anybody to talk. You can't get any witnesses. It's technically foreign soil. So there's not a whole lot you can do. So they just closed the case. I mean, what are you going to do?
Sure.
And Putin's a master of that. I mean, he took out oligarchs. It's like, so
Yeah, I mean, he'll go anywhere in the world to
in
find
London, he killed the guy who put him in power. His name is escaping me. There's a play on Broadway about it right now. But the guy who picked Putin when Boris Yeltsin was such a drunk, he had to step aside. Putin was a taxi driver in St. Petersburg. The ex-KGB was now driving a taxi. And this guy foolishly said, let me get this Putin guy because he'll, like Yeltsin, do whatever I tell him to do. And this is the guy that owned all the TV stations and everything and had a piece of everything that was going down. He was the original oligarch. And he put Putin in power, and then Putin turned into a little weasel and turned against him. So this guy went to London and started speaking out against Putin and Abramovich, if you know that name,
Yes.
James Abramovich,
Yes.
who was the younger kind of up-and-coming oligarch who turned his
Right.
back on this guy. And Putin whacked this guy outside of London. He died in his bathroom mysteriously, Same way Dr. Bornstein died,
Right.
If the
Look-
Russians want you dead, you're dead,
Yeah, and it sounds like Trump borrowed from that
Yes.
playbook.
Or utilized it, or
Yes.
had guys ahead of Trump. And that's why you can't take anything on face value, because there's a lot of money at stake with Trump. It ain't just about Trump and MAGA and all this stuff. It's about billionaires. It's about an international cartel that wants to keep doing business as usual, both in the United States with guys like the Koch brothers and the oil and gas industry, where it's a lot easier to have dudes buying big pickup trucks and fracking. And not that we're Democrats are going to stop all that anyway. We're making more oil now, producing more oil now than we did in Trump's era. But my point is, there's big multinational corporations that have a stake in this, and there's big foreign interests. KSA, these guys can get away with all kinds of stuff. Russia,
Well, look, man, I know your time is precious, and I know you've got someplace that you've got to go. You don't have to answer me right now. I would just express to you that sometime after the election, if you've got time, I'd love to have you back on just to talk post-election stuff and whatever might be happening then. But tell people where they can find you, Noel.
Thank you, Jack. And first of all, I had a blast. So clearly I would love to come
thank you.
back here to do it. Let's definitely do it. I do a lot of these things. I don't know I've enjoyed one as much as this in a long time. So thank you
Cool,
for having
man.
me.
I
You're a
appreciate
smart
that.
guy. Well, most people don't ask good questions. Not most guys, but you know what I mean? You haven't, you know what you're talking about. And that's interesting because it brings things out in me. And I apologize. I know I speak in paragraphs. I'm just passionate about
no.
this stuff.
That's why I wanted you on. So I thank you from the
No,
bottom
it's
of my
important
heart.
to give people an overview. Like, none of us have the answers because none of us have been here before, right?
Right.
But the more information we have and the more you can see what may be going on, it's like they always say, follow the money. Who
Right.
stands to benefit from every chaotic thing? Because a lot of this stuff is look over here. I'd always say, Trump is the guy who walks in the store, falls on the ground and flops around, pretends to have a seizure while somebody else goes around the corner and empties out the cash register. That's a good analogy to think of this thing. So they can find me at Noel's Notes on Substack, noelcasler.com, and the Noel Casler podcast. And I'll be shooting my mouth off on all the Twitter and all that kind of stuff. So thanks again for having me, brother.
Awesome, brother. Listen, thank you so much. I enjoyed it immensely as well. We'll get together in the future. And in the meantime, keep kicking ass like you have been.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.